Hey there. Today we're going to dive deep, really deep, into how the U.S. Space Force operates. We're talking Space Doctrine Publication 4.0, and specifically sustainment. How they keep everything running smoothly up there.
Think of SDP 4.0 as like the playbook.
Yeah,
It's the guide for how the U.S. Space Force plans to stay dominant in space.
okay, that makes sense. But it's one thing to launch satellites, but keeping them up and running in such a harsh environment, that's got to be tough, especially when things get a little tense internationally.
You're absolutely right. SDP 4.0 knows that space operations, they don't happen in a bubble. It ranges from peaceful cooperation to, and hopefully it never gets to this, but armed conflict.
All right, so break this down for us. What does this spectrum have to do with sustainment?
Well, imagine a line, a continuum. On one side, you've got international partners working together, maybe on research, maybe sharing satellite data. Sustainment there is about, making sure everyone is using compatible tech, keeping those communication channels open.
So making sure everyone is literally and figuratively on the same page.
Yeah, exactly. But as we move down this line, things get a little more intense. We're talking competition, like attempts to jam those satellite signals or maybe cyber attacks on space systems.
And that's got to make sustainment even more important. You need to be ready to counter those threats, keep everything operational.
You got it. Sustainment becomes about resilience. Think backup systems, redundant communication links, and having countermeasures ready to go. Then, at the far end of the spectrum, you have actual conflict, where sustainment, it's absolutely critical.
Because if something goes down in a conflict, even temporarily, that could be devastating, right?
Absolutely. Imagine GPS satellites being taken out. Not just military operations would be affected, but civilian transportation, communication networks, everything. Sustainment in that scenario means getting those capabilities back online, ASAP, maybe even deploying replacements, using different systems.
It's a high-stakes game of chess, always thinking several moves ahead.
That's a great way to put it. SDP 4.0 gives us a framework, a way to think about those what-ifs and make sure the Space Force can handle anything.
So sustainment is a lot more than just fixing something when it breaks. It's about thinking ahead, planning for the worst, and making sure those space capabilities are always online no matter what's happening.
Exactly. It's about having a system, a sustainment enterprise that is flexible, responsive, and supports every single thing the Space Force does. To really understand how SDP 4.0 tackles this, we got to look at the three segments of space operations. We're talking orbital, terrestrial, and link.
Okay, let's do it. First up, orbital. That's everything up in space, right?
Satellites, telescopes, space stations, you name it. If it's in orbit, it's part of that orbital segment. And keeping those assets running, well, that has its own set of challenges.
Because it's not like you can just, send a repair crew up there easily. So what are some of the big things to think about with orbital sustainment?
Well, for a long time, we thought of spacecraft as having a pretty limited lifespan. Launch them, they do their thing, eventually run out of fuel or something breaks down.
And then it becomes another piece of space junk.
Unfortunately, yes. But SDP 4.0, it's saying that things are changing. We're moving to a world of what we call on-orbit sustainment. Basically, we're talking about making spacecraft last longer, repairing them in space, even building big structures up there.
Wait, are we talking building stuff in space? That sounds like a sci-fi movie.
It does sound futuristic, but it's becoming a reality. Take on-orbit refueling, for example. That's already happening. Back in 2020, a company actually extended the life of a satellite. They docked with it, took over its maneuvering, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. That is incredible. So if you can refuel a satellite up there, what else can you do?
The possibilities, they're pretty amazing when you think about it. Imagine repairing or upgrading satellites while they're still up there instead of bringing them down and launching new ones. Or how about assembling giant space telescopes, even habitats, piece by piece?
So instead of launching a finished telescope, which would be limited by how big our rockets are, we launch it in parts and assemble it in space. Now that is a game changer.
Exactly. And it's not just about building stuff. On-orbit servicing could also mean inspecting for damage, maybe clearing out some of that debris we talked about, even moving things to different orbits if we need to.
So it's like having a cosmic tow truck and a repair shop all in one.
You got it. And SDP 4.0 recognizes that this isn't the stuff of science fiction anymore. This is becoming the real deal, and it has the potential to totally change how we keep our space capabilities up and running.
It's amazing. But with all this talk of building and refueling in space, are we just making more space debris?
That's definitely something to consider, and SDP 4.0 makes it clear. Space operations have to be responsible and sustainable.
So it's not just what we can do up there, but how we do it, right? We need to think about the long game.
Exactly. As we get more into this on-orbit servicing, we've got to do it the right way, minimizing debris, making sure our actions don't create more risk in an already pretty crowded space.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've talked about keeping things running in orbit, but what about back here on Earth? What's sustainment like for the terrestrial part of space operations?
Well, the terrestrial segment, that's all the infrastructure down here on the ground. Launch sites, control centers, tracking stations, communications, you name it. Basically everything that supports our stuff in space.
It's easy to forget about everything down here when you're focused on all the cool stuff happening in space.
Yeah.
But it's all connected, isn't it?
100%. And just like with the orbital stuff, the terrestrial segment has its own unique challenges when it comes to sustainment.
Like what? What are some examples?
Think about where all this stuff is located. Launch sites are usually near the equator, tracking stations are all over the world, and control centers, they're often far from cities for security reasons.
So just keeping track of all that, let alone maintaining it, that must be a logistical nightmare.
It's definitely a challenge for sure. You have to think about the climate, the political situation in different places, the logistics of getting people and equipment to some pretty remote places.
Not to mention the security. I
Well,
mean, these facilities, they're vital to our space program, which probably makes them targets, right?
100%. Security is paramount. SDP 40 stresses strong cybersecurity, physical security, the whole nine yards to protect these assets.
It's like they're these high-tech fortresses protecting all the important stuff that makes our space operations work.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of important stuff, we can't forget about the most vital part of all of this, the people.
You're right. Space systems, they don't run themselves. We're talking about the guardians, the ones who operate and maintain all this complex technology, right?
Exactly. SDP 40, it's clear about how important having the right people is for maintaining space superiority. It talks about needing a highly skilled, highly trained workforce to handle all this cutting-edge stuff.
Which has got to be tough, right? You're talking about some pretty specialized fields. Aerospace engineering, satellite operations, cybersecurity. It's not like they teach this stuff at every corner.
You're telling me. And the Space Force, it's still pretty new, so they're actively building their teams, coming up with training programs to meet these really unique needs.
So it's not just finding the best and brightest, it's making sure they have what they need to stay ahead of the game, right?
Right on. And don't forget, technology in space, it changes so fast. What's top of the line today might be obsolete tomorrow, so these guys gotta constantly be learning, constantly adapting.
It's like that old saying, if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. Especially in space, where things are always changing.
Absolutely. And SDP 40, it stresses something called life cycle sustainment planning. Basically, it means thinking about how to maintain and upgrade systems from the very beginning, even before they're up and running.
So you're building in sustainment from day one, not just tacking it on as an afterthought.
Exactly. It's a lot smarter and cheaper, too, to design something with maintenance and upgrades in mind, rather than trying to figure it out later on.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we've covered orbital sustainment, which is keeping everything running in space, and terrestrial sustainment, which is all the stuff on the ground. That leaves us with the link segment. And honestly, that one sounds a little complicated. What exactly does it mean?
Think of the link segment as the connection, the communication highway between everything in space. It's all the signals, uplinks, downlinks, crosslinks, the whole shebang that let us talk to and control our stuff up there.
So it's basically what lets us send commands to satellites, get information back, and keep everything in the loop.
Right. You got it. Without a strong, reliable link segment, we're essentially blind and deaf up there.
That makes sense. So what makes sustaining the link segment different from, say, maintaining a satellite or a ground station?
Oh, it's a whole different ballgame. One of the biggest things is that the electromagnetic spectrum, that's what we use for communication in space, it's getting super crowded. And not just crowded, but also more contested.
Congested. What do you mean?
Well, every satellite, every radar system, every radio signal, it all uses this electromagnetic spectrum. And with more and more stuff being launched, both from Earth and into space, that spectrum is getting jam-packed. Think of it like a cosmic traffic jam.
A cosmic traffic jam. I like it.
Right, and it's not just about things being crowded. The spectrum is also becoming more contested, which means there are folks out there who might try to jam, mess with, or even hijack our communication signals.
So it's like cyber warfare, but in space. That sounds like something out of a movie.
It might sound like science fiction, but it's a very real thing. And that's why this link segment, keeping it secure, is so important. SDP 4.0, it really hammers home the need for backup communication systems, having different routes for signals, and strong cybersecurity so we can stay connected to our space stuff no matter what.
So just like with the other segments, it's about having a plan B and maybe even a plan C.
Exactly. And this also shows how important partnerships are. We're talking about working with other countries, maybe sharing infrastructure, and even teaming up with private companies who are coming up with really innovative tech for secure space communication.
Because in space, just like down here, communication is key.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now that we've got a handle on these three segments, let's talk about some of the bigger challenges the Space Force faces when it comes to keeping everything running. One of the big ones is that a lot of space systems, they're what we call high demand, low density, or HDLD for short.
Okay, I've got to admit I'm not familiar with that term. What does HDLD mean when we're talking about space?
It means we're dealing with systems that everybody wants to use, they're in high demand, but there just aren't that many of them. They're low density. Think of it like a really advanced spy satellite. It provides crucial intel, everyone wants the data, but we might only have a few of them up there.
So if one of those has a problem, it's a huge deal, right?
Yeah.
There's no backup just waiting on the ground.
Exactly. And because these systems are so unique, getting parts, fixing them, even training people to use them, it's all really complicated and really expensive. It's not like taking your car to the mechanic.
So it's a tough situation.
Yeah,
Not only are these systems crucial, but they're also a pain to maintain.
you got it. And to make things even trickier, a lot of our space systems, they've been up there for a while. They've been doing the job for decades, which is great. But just like with anything old, they need some extra TLC.
It's like trying to keep a classic car running, right? Finding parts for old tech can't be easy.
It can be a real headache. We're talking about obsolescence, which means parts are getting harder and harder to find. Sometimes we even have to reverse engineer them because the companies that made them don't even exist anymore.
Talk about a challenge. It's like trying to find parts for a Model T in 2024.
You get the idea. And then there's the problem of finding people who know how to work on these older systems.
Because the people who designed them have all retired.
Exactly. Finding experienced technicians who understand this legacy tech, it's getting tougher every day. That's why training new people, the next generation of space professionals, is so important.
So, the Space Force, they're trying to keep these older systems running while also developing new technology at lightning speed. It's a lot to handle.
That's an understatement. And that brings us to another big idea in SDP 4.0, rapid fielding programs.
Rapid fielding programs. What exactly are we talking about there?
So these programs, they're all about getting new tech, new capabilities out there as fast as possible, especially when there are new threats popping up. We're talking about speeding up that whole acquisition process, making testing more efficient, basically getting those systems into the hands of the Guardians ASAP.
Speed is essential, for sure. But I imagine that sometimes trying to do things so fast, it might create problems for sustainment down the road. If you're rushing to get something out there, you don't always have time to think about how you're going to maintain it long term.
That's a good point, and SDP 4.0 acknowledges that. It emphasizes that just rushing to field something quickly can't be at the expense of making sure it's sustainable. That's why the doctrine really emphasizes something we call life cycle sustainment planning.
So that's like what we were talking about earlier, thinking about the maintenance, the logistics, right from the start, even before the system is complete.
Exactly. It's about designing systems that are built to be maintained easily, ensuring that we've got those parts ready to go, and making sure these systems can be upgraded to keep up with new and emerging threats.
Makes sense. The last thing you want is to end up with a system that's obsolete or just too expensive to maintain a few years down the line.
Exactly. And thinking about all this from the beginning, it makes things easier for the Guardians, too. They're already dealing with a lot, trying to operate in such a demanding and constantly changing environment.
Working smarter, not harder, as they say.
100%. And SDP 4.0, it recognizes that having a system for sustainment, one that's robust and adaptable, that's the key to making sure the Space Force can get the mission done, not just today, but for years and years to come.
Laying the groundwork for a sustainable future in space, it sounds like.
Exactly. Which brings us to our last thought for our listeners today. As we continue to explore and utilize space sustainment, it's only going to become even more crucial.
Because as we become more and more reliant on these space-based systems, Even a temporary disruption could have huge ripple effects, right?
Absolutely. Whether it's our GPS satellites protecting those communication networks from interference or just maintaining our ability to identify threats from space, sustainment is critical for our security, our economy, basically our way of life.
It's the foundation of our space power.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into SDP 40, I'd encourage everyone to take some time to read through it. It's a fascinating look at what it takes to maintain space superiority and a real testament to all the hard work that the Guardians do day in and day out.
Great advice. And thanks to everyone for joining us for this deep dive into the world of space sustainment. Until next time, stay curious.